Hello, everybody. It's really lovely to see so many familiar faces. My husband has made fun of me over the years for the pleasure I take in stories about plagues and epidemics. If we went to a bookstore and he found one, he'd say, "Look, here's another book about the Black Death." But I do take a lot of pleasure in these. And over the years, I have loved teaching medical humanities, both to undergraduate pre-med majors, to English majors, to medical students, and working with medical professionals, because I think that the stories we tell ourselves about sickness and suffering and death and dying are really consequential. And I also think that people of faith really need to pay attention to those stories. They have a long history. These days, it seems to me that most of us, or many of us, are watching the news pretty compulsively, looking for stories. And so I want to focus in the time we have on how stories about plagues and epidemics and pandemics have been told, and what we can learn from the way they are told, and who gets to tell them, and the purposes for which they get told. It's probably useful to know that there's been a major epidemic in every single recorded century. This is not new. And there's a difference, of course, between epidemics and pandemics, but most of you know about the Black Plague, for instance, in 1347 and 48, which killed off about 2/3 of the population in Europe. And that's only in Europe. The Black Plague really extended well into Asia and Africa. And many of the stories of plagues and epidemics that we've heard come to us through Western literature, but it's good to remember that they have affected the rest of the globe, the big ones. Here's some examples, for instance, of stories that you just might recognize. There are over 100 references to plagues in the Bible. And of course, frequent references to leprosy, which was a kind of epidemic. It was an endemic disease that kept coming up, and it resulted in exclusion from the community. The Iliad opens with a plague. Oedipus opens in the context of a plague. The Black Plague in the 13th century was the context for Boccaccio's Decameron, which is an important landmark in Western literature. And it's a series of stories that are told by people who have fled from the plague. The 11th book of Milton's Paradise Lost is this long story of Western history told by means of all the plagues and epidemics that have unrolled on the human scene. And then in the 19th century, we get Edgar Allan Poe's The Masque of the Red Death. Some of you are familiar with that. Or Alessandro Manzoni's big novel, The Betrothed. It's kind of like what Middlemarch was, or Moby Dick in the 19th century for Italian readers. And it features a story of the plague in 17th century Milan. And I'll refer to that some later. In the 20th century, one of the stories to come out of the influenza epidemic of 1918 and up to 1920 was Catherine Ann Porter's short story, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And I'm sure that you recognize the reference to the Book of Revelation. And then many of you know Albert Camus' The Plague, which was written after World War II. And then more recently, we've had many stories that have come out of the AIDS epidemic. In fact, the way I got into medical humanities originally was that I was teaching at Mills College during the AIDS epidemic, the kind of cresting of it in the mid-1980s. And I went over to San Francisco just to look and see what kind of literature was coming out of that epidemic. And there were shelves full of stories and poems and plays and memoirs. And so I wrote a paper about those and went to the professional meeting and found out there were other people doing this. That was sort of the beginning of medical humanities making its way back into medical education. So here are some of the things that these stories, in the various ways that they're told, help us to recognize. And these are really common features. One is that epidemics take existing scientific and medical practices to a new learning edge. So there's always some story about what we don't know, and they really enforce the business of scientific research in a very particular direction. They have a sense of urgency to them. So epidemics take us collectively to a new learning edge. They always open opportunity for innovation. I mean, one of the ways they do that is just necessity. For instance, there was a point during the 17th century plague in London when they didn't know what to do with the dead bodies, which is the technological problem in a lot of these major epidemics. And they started chucking them in the Thames, which then became unnavigable in places because there were so many bodies in the river. So people had to figure out ways to get water around, ways to move things around. And obviously, as I speak, you will think, if you've been watching the news, about some of the issues we've been looking at, just about how we get what we need to where it's needed, who pays for it, who gets to use it, and so on. Another thing that comes up in all of these stories is that they always have economic problems that emerge. And the whole class system comes into question. Because the matter of who gets healthcare that we're facing right now is always there. So who tells the story and on whose behalf the story is told and who is featured as a hero? It's not always the doctors, or the doctors are often the heroes and the villains. And I'll come back to this sort of cast of characters later. Another common feature is that a plague is always a political event. Almost immediately, as soon as news of it begins to spread, it becomes a political event, it becomes a media event, and it produces scapegoating and blame. So it begins to identify populations who are affected, populations who come under scrutiny because they're suspected. They always renew our awareness of our connectedness and our vulnerability. And that connectedness is, as one poet put it, beautiful and terrifying. I will, if we have time at the end, I would love to read you a poem, which I didn't print out, so I'll have to look it up. But some of you may have seen in recent days a poem that's been circulated online by Lynn Unger called Pandemic. And she is the one, I think, who has that phrase, the terrible and beautiful ways we are connected. So that always comes up in these stories. They always pose moral challenges because situations of public health crisis bring out the very best and the very worst among us in very invisible ways. But these are difficult stories to tell, in the same way that war is a difficult story to tell. And there are a lot of analogies between stories of epidemics and stories of war. The reason is because they're so multi-stranded and many-sided. We keep using the term epicenter, but epidemics are things that often begin in various places and they can't quite figure out why there are a few cases here and a few cases there. And so trying to connect what's happening in different places and find the common threads is one of the challenges. There are these multiple agendas too in telling. People have different reasons for telling the story. And it's a hard story to tell because it's inconclusive. There isn't a clear beginning and end. We keep talking about the curve and flattening the curve, and we see graphs, and you would think that there would be sort of a clear trajectory. And certainly epidemiologists see that there's a rise and fall to a plague, but they're so chaotic it's really difficult to find a vantage point. And we'll come back to that. But one analogy I'd like to give you is that I had the privilege one time of teaching War and Peace for a whole semester. And there's a chapter in War and Peace where Napoleon is standing on a hill looking at the Battle of Austerlitz, I think it is. And you get the story of the battle briefly from Napoleon's vantage point, and what the reader begins to see is that he really doesn't know what's going on. He's too far away. But then it shifts to the vantage point of a soldier who's right in the middle of it. And what the reader begins to see is he doesn't know what's going on either, because he's in the thick of it and all he can see is dust and blood and horses. And so the point that the chapter is making, or the passage, is there isn't a definitive vantage point from which to tell an authoritative story. It's a story that just has too many points of view that are possible. So one of the things that these stories begin with is, some of them, is a meta-narrative. And a meta-narrative is a story about the story. For instance, Defoe talks about, periodically in his story about the plague in the 17th century, Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, he keeps bringing up this question of, is this worth telling? And maybe there's no real definitive way to tell this. And he says at one point, all sources are tainted, including this one. Like, I'm not sure how to tell this is one of the things that keeps coming up. Or in Manzoni's The Betrothed, the 19th century story of the 16th century plague in Milan, he keeps reminding us that he, the narrator, that he's a historian who's piecing together material that fell into his keeping after the plague, and he has it from letters, private letters of people, and fragmentary government documents that he's not supposed to have, and little snippets of this and that. So he's piecing it together, but we're reminded throughout that this can't possibly be the whole story, because all any of us has is fragments. So that feature of the meta-narrative, I think, is an interesting common feature in plague and epidemic stories, because it's something we're all in. And I think it's a very healthy reminder that also in war stories, we'd like there to be an authoritative story, but there isn't. And I think there's something really biblical about that. If you think about the fact that the sacred text we have is 66 stories of all different genres, written over a period of 6,000 years by different narrators. There's something about that that is true to the human situation, which is what we know is true. We know by experience, we know by inference, we know in lots of ways, but we don't just get one definitive rule book. We get it in lots of voices from lots of angles of vision. Another feature that's common to many of the plague stories is early on, you get a sense of widening awareness. This is there in almost every one of them. The fact of illness among us begins to dawn on somebody. And in some stories, this is almost comic. At the beginning of Camus' The Plague, for instance, which is about a plague that afflicts a town named Oran in Algeria, he just notices rats. He starts to see that there are rats that have died in the streets. And the reader, of course, understands early on what these rats mean, but it takes him a while to see enough rats to get it. Or in Defoe, I'm just going to jump around among these plague narratives because I'm trying to talk about what they have in common. But what his narrator notices is that there's a list of the dead in different districts of London that's posted in different neighborhoods, who's died that week. It's like the obituaries in the newspaper. And he just begins to notice that the list is getting longer. And then he goes to other neighborhoods and he notices that the list is longer there too. So there's this kind of dawning awareness that something is happening among us. And you don't yet know how big it is. You don't know where it's from. You don't know who's involved. So there's this kind of long inferential period where you're just the narrator is just trying to piece together what's happening. And the reader, of course, is experiencing a certain dramatic irony because we know what's unfolding. But that theme of blindness, or how understanding comes upon us, I think is a really interesting one to trace among these stories. In some of the stories, like Pale Horse, Pale Rider, the main character just begins to notice her own symptoms. And she explains them away one after another. Well, I have these terrible headaches. And she begins to have hallucinations, and she decides they were just bad dreams. But there's a long period when she's explaining away, because really acknowledging what's happening means you have to shift your whole paradigm, or your sense of what's normal, or your sense of what you're able to take in. And then, of course, awareness is very quickly followed by denial. And denial usually goes on for a long period. And I just want to remind you here that as I tell you about these features of plague narratives, it's important to look around and consider what you've heard on the news, seen in the newspapers, seen online for the last several weeks, because all of these features are there. I'm going to read you a little account from Jack London's 1912 story, The Scarlet Plague. Interestingly, that story, again written in 1912, is a futuristic tale that's set in the year 2060 about a plague that took place in 2013. And so this old man is telling his grandchildren about having lived through the plague. And he says, "Word came of a strange disease that had broken out in New York. Nobody thought anything about the news. It was only a small thing. There had been only a few deaths, it seemed, though that they had died very quickly, and that one of the first signs of the disease was turning red of the face and all the body. Within 24 hours came the report of the first case in Chicago. And on the same day, it was made public that London, the greatest city in the world next to Chicago, had been secretly fighting the plague for 2 weeks and censoring the news dispatches. That is, not permitting word to go forth to the rest of the world that London had the plague. It looked serious," he says, "but we in California, like everywhere else, were not alarmed. We were sure that the bacteriologists would find a way to overcome this new germ, just as they had overcome germs in the past." I picked that one partly because it's written in California, and partly because a part of denial is complacency. We are not going to be affected. We are somehow insulated. We are somehow among the privileged. But as soon as information does start to go abroad and people are in denial, also the people in charge, usually some combination of city councils, governors, doctors, health experts, begin to try to control information. So this question of who gets to know what is always that issue. It's very important in Manzoni's story, The Betrothed. They have a city council, and they not only decide what the public gets to know and what they don't get to know, but they also try to concoct a story that will keep the public appeased for as long as possible. So they're already crafting a narrative that will be very selective. The people who get the information are usually the literate elite. They're usually the people with money or power. Sometimes it's the priests, because of course they had some power for many of the years we're talking about. And then in more recent stories and films, of course, I haven't mentioned the many, many films about plagues and epidemics. It's usually the CDC, the CIA, the FBI, the NIH, and the World Health Organization. They are people who get to know things and have to decide what kind of knowledge gets disseminated. And so at this stage in the story, there's usually some kind of bureaucratic delay and secrecy. They don't want panic. They don't want markets to be affected. So already the plague, very early on in these stories, the plague has become politicized, and it's become a story about money. Who has the money? Who has the resources? And then the investigative journalists start. And often the narrator is some kind of investigative reporter or journalist, or somebody who's sort of coming in from the outside and doesn't really belong to the privileged elite. Like in the Betrothed, the 19th century story, Lorenzo, one of the main characters, has to become an outlaw to get information. He just decides he's going to break the firewall. His beloved has contracted the plague. She's been taken off to a lazaretto, which is a really slum-like hospital. He can't get to her. He wants information. So he finds ways to get information, and then he starts spreading it by word of mouth. And then it becomes rumor. These days it would go up on blogs and tweets. So control of information always falls apart. The people in control aren't in control. So then we also get the stage of population control. They're not just trying to control information, they have to control movement of populations. And this comes when the threat of mob behavior gets to a certain point. And acts of desperation then lead to decisions to exclude people or quarantine them. In the Middle Ages, you could exclude people from the town. You just close the town gates, don't let people in. Quarantine, of course, more recently has been a much more complicated political issue. It's a civil rights issue. During the AIDS epidemic, there was a proposal to quarantine essentially the gay population in California, and that didn't go through, but there was a great hue and cry, and it was a very, a really hard public discussion about what is a matter of healthcare and what is a matter of civil rights. It's not coming up in quite the same inflammatory way now, but as quarantine goes on, we are already seeing that there are people in different parts of the country that are resisting quarantine and really are taking it to the matter of civil rights. So factions begin to emerge, and this is where the stories always get really complicated, and we get these meanwhile back at the ranch kinds of scenes because things are going on in so many places. There are prophets who are issuing warnings. There are pundits who are interpreting events. There are the blamers. There are the deniers. There are the adapters that get invested in their own competing stories. So the public has a lot of stories to sift through. And in some of the plague narratives, the reader has a lot to sift through. Okay, so another common feature at this point is flight. People breaking the barriers, breaking quarantine. They're afraid, they just want to go. I've mentioned the Decameron, and I will say that this is a series of stories, not all of which are about the plague or about illness, but they're stories that are told by a group of people who have decided to head for the hills to get out of danger. So they leave the city of Florence and they go up into the hills and they eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow they might die. But the lady who decides to put together this expedition, she persuades a few of her fellow churchgoers to join her because she says to them that it's a moral duty to take all possible measures to preserve your own life. What are we doing here, she asks. What are we waiting for? Why are we slower to protect our health than all the rest of the citizens? So then the whole opening scene becomes an elaborate justification for the retreat of these 10 storytellers to a place that's quite luxurious in the middle of the general contagion, to enjoy all the privileges of retreat and body entertainment. We get some of this replicated in Poe's Masque of the Red Death, where people have gone away and engaged in their own entertainment, tried to isolate themselves and party. And I have to say, the partying that went on the Florida beaches that we've been reading about in the news these last days certainly reminded me of that. There is a kind of what the hell attitude, literally, that emerges among people who handle their fear in that way. A similar flight takes place in the story, in Jack London's story of the Scarlet Plague, and I thought this one was entertaining enough to tell you about. This is a flight of the academic elite. The story is told by a man who had been an English professor at UC Berkeley in 2013, when the plague happened. And they decide to take over the chemistry building. And so he gets a bunch of his colleagues together and they take over the chemistry building, and that becomes their fortification. And he writes, already the people had fled from the city by millions. At first the rich in their private motor cars and dirigibles, and then the great mass of the population on foot, carrying the plague with them, themselves starving and pillaging, and farmers and all the towns and villages on the way. But these people are holed up in the chemistry building. And then what happens is that as some of them begin to die, 2 of them are consigned to take the bodies out. And so the group in the building becomes smaller and smaller. At the beginning of Camus' story, The Plague, the doctor, who's the main character, has a choice about whether to stay with the town that's going to be quarantined and walled off. So he'll be stuck in there with all the people who have the plague, or to leave. And his wife is outside. And so he has this moral decision to make at the very beginning. The doctor and the priest are both very important characters in that story, but his decision to stay with the town is a defining feature of the story. He doesn't make it because he's heroic. He makes it because he feels there's a kind of inevitability to it. Here's another interesting thing that happens in these stories about plagues and epidemics. Language changes. Speech itself changes. A lot of words become loaded. Words become buzzwords. Scientific vocabulary or medical vocabulary comes into common use. Terms that we're seeing now, like social distancing or references to a virus none of us ever heard of before, become very common. And then they begin to sort of be appropriated and lose their kind of scientific definitions and become watered down in certain ways. And one of the ways that speech changes also is that certain groups take control of the public narrative. And so there are words that keep being threaded into the public narrative, so that if you hear those words, you identify them with certain groups. This happens in politics all the time. And I want to pause for a little bit about probably the dominant metaphor in most of these stories, and certainly in the story that's unfolding among us now, and that is war. Military metaphors are pervasive in American medicine in particular. It's not as true in medical practice in other countries, although I think the war metaphor has become fairly common everywhere. But American medicine, for historical reasons I won't go into, has really, in particular, appropriated military language. Think about how we have a war on cancer and we bombard things with antibiotics, and we take aggressive measures, and we try to kill things off, and so on. This language of aggression and bombardment and violence really pervades medical practice. One of the things that people in medical humanities are trying to do, along with a lot of the doctors and med students they work with, is look for other ways of talking about illness and treatment. Because there are problems with adopting the war metaphor. War against disease becomes a kind of holy war, and religious, military, and medical language interpenetrate and begin to be used interchangeably. Also, this way of imagining what's happening can very quickly go beyond useful analogy to a dangerous confusion of moral, political, legal, and medical issues. And it begins to heighten the potential for injustice. War becomes a justification for all kinds of strategies that then don't get examined in the same way. And that language of warfare also curiously has worked both ways. That in some instances, war has appropriated metaphors from medicine or from biology. And one completely odious example is, if you recall, the way Hitler used the term vermin and the trying to exterminate the vermin as a way of talking about getting rid of a whole population of people and as a justification for genocide. In any case, war is an available vehicle for describing the magnitude of the threat. And then it comes to refer not only to the disease, but also to the segments of the society who are the victims of disease. That's one of the ways it's dangerous. Who are we at war against? I mean, one of the things that's come up in the news, of course, over the last week is the problem of calling the coronavirus a Chinese virus. That's just one example that we've seen over and over again of identifying the problem with a group of people. I'm going to skip a little bit here because I want to make sure we have enough time to have a Q&A, but let's see. It's always hard to skip through pages, but I'm going to go over to public narratives and private narratives for a moment. The public narratives are of several kinds. One is eyewitness accounts, and these are often competitive. I'm going to read you one of these. So eyewitness accounts often have something sort of sensationalized about them, like people telling other people in order to be the teller. So they become sort of competitive. I had one really ghoulish one, but I can't find it. Oh yeah, here's one from Boccaccio. In men and women alike, there appeared at the beginning of the malady certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, whereof some waxed of the bigness of a common apple, others like an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. From these two parts, the aforesaid death-bearing plague boils proceeded in brief space to appear and come indifferently to every part of the body, wherefrom after a while the fashion of the contagion began to change into black or livid blotches, which showed themselves in many first on the arms and about the thighs, and after spread to every other part of the person, in some large and sparse, and in others small and thick sown, and like as the plague boils had been first and yet were a very certain token of coming death, even so these were for everyone to whom they came. Well, that's just part of a very long paragraph about detailing what it looked like. There's another one, I don't know if you've read The Hot Zone, and this is not an eyewitness. Well, yeah, I actually think some of it was an eyewitness account, but Richard Preston went and investigated the Ebola outbreak in 1976 when it first appeared among human beings. And he has a 4-page section in The Hot Zone just going into every single bloody detail of how bad it can look. So that's another common feature of these narratives, is that they really get us to dwell on how awful it is. Many of them appeal to a sort of morbid fascination, and many of them turn into these kind of dystopian fantasies that are just basically blood and guts, especially recent films. As I was thinking about this, I looked up films about plagues and epidemics. If you Google that in, it comes up with a really interesting list of films like Outbreak and Contagion. There's one called Virus, there's one called Infection, but then there are a whole raft of these increasingly grisly and dystopian ones that I don't have too much interest in looking at. But so that's another dimension of these stories, is the ways in which they pique the popular imagination and awaken this kind of morbid fascination. So there are eyewitness accounts, there are popular apocryphal science and theories, and they're debunkers. There are stories that have to do with how this all came about. Lots of conspiracy theories. And the interesting thing about conspiracy theories is that there are conspiracies, but it's very hard these days, since conspiracy theory has become such a term of dismissal, to actually investigate conspiracies and call them that. So you see how the language kind of works back on itself. And sometimes I think when somebody says, well, that's just a conspiracy theory about a big public event, I think, well, this stuff doesn't really happen without somebody conspiring somewhere. But if you become tagged as a conspiracy theorist, then your story is dismissed. So that's another way in which who gets to tell it, how do you tell it, and for what purpose do you tell it, and what audience do you expect to attract, all become very fluid matters in telling about a public health crisis. Then there are the stories that frame the whole thing as an economic threat, that the plague almost, or the epidemic, becomes backgrounded to a story of general economic breakdown and decline. The incentive system breaks down, the class system breaks down, the supplies are dwindling, as we see now, the stock market starts to crash. So the money story, whether it's foregrounded or backgrounded, is always a dimension of these stories. And then there are the either whole stories or parts of stories that are very much focused on the private experience of suffering. And here's where many of the stories of plagues and epidemics move into either episodes or chapters that I think of as moments of grace in the stories. And that's where sometimes a priest will enter as a character, sometimes a character will be dying, but the God question comes up. Where is God in this suffering? Or people have visions, or people start to pray, or a priest comes. And one of the most interesting of these kinds of what I think of as the moments of grace is in Camus' story, The Plague, where one of the priests who has stayed in the town, Father Panelu, preaches 2 different sermons in the course of the novel. His first sermon is full of abstractions, and it's very much focused on the Old Testament God and plague as a punishment to the people. And then in the course of the story, he sees a child die, and it just undoes him. And after that, he preaches the second sermon. And in the second sermon, his uncertainty, his bewilderment, his identification with human suffering, all come into the foreground. It's kind of more like, my God, why have you abandoned me? And he identifies with the people. Instead of saying you, he says we. And so you see how the plague is a setting for these moments of deep theological searching and heart-opening confrontation with the question of suffering, vulnerability, need, and longing for, sometimes longing for death, but longing for a relationship with a God who is bigger than Earth, than the planet. So always and often near the end of the story, we get the theological chapter, the theological dimension. There's a part in Pale Horse, Pale Rider that I copied out because I thought it was kind of an almost comic version of one of those moments. One character says to another, she realizes that she has influenza and she's likely to die. He doesn't realize it yet, but they're both very troubled, and this is a couple. He's about to go off to war and she's about to die of influenza. Do you remember any prayers? She asked him suddenly. Did you ever learn any in Sunday school? Not much, confessed Adam without contrition. Well, the Lord's Prayer. Yes, and there's Hail Mary, she said, and the really useful one beginning, I confess to Almighty God and to Blessed Mary, ever Virgin, and to the holy apostles Peter and Paul. So, and then it goes on, and they're trying to remember these prayers, and then they remember a spiritual that is about the pale horse and the pale rider. What it reminded me of when I reread that recently was a little segment of the movie A Bridge Too Far, where Robert Redford is playing a soldier who's at war in Germany, and they've set a bomb and it's about to go off, and he doesn't think he's going to get away in time. He's rowing his boat. He keeps saying, Hail Mary, full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace, Hail Mary, full of grace, because it's all he can remember. But it's a very touching, kind of funny, sweet moment where you think it's what he's got. But it comes as a kind of climax. The prayer scene in a number of these stories comes as a kind of climax because there's nothing left. It's a turning point. Two other things I want to mention, and then I'm going to stop, and I hope there will be some questions. One is that another kind of backgrounded dimension of these stories, but one that's worth paying attention to, is reflection on the effects on the natural world. That plagues and epidemics and seasons of illness like this involve us with the natural world in new ways. And of course, we know that now. We know that because these zoonotic diseases that jump from animals to humans, there are more of them among us, SARS and MERS and H1N1 and AIDS and Ebola. All of these are emerging because we're tearing down the rainforests where these microbes had hosts. And so they're jumping into human populations. So if we connect the dots, disease does take us back to understanding our place in the natural world in some very important and consequential ways. I'm going to read you a very short paragraph from Jack London's story that pertains to this. He says, the old man telling about the plague says, a strange thing was what was taking place with all the domestic animals. Everywhere they were going wild and preying on one another. The chickens and ducks were the first to be destroyed, while the pigs were the first to go wild, followed by the cats. Nor were the dogs long in adapting themselves to the changed conditions. There was a veritable plague of dogs. They devoured the corpses, barked and howled during the nights, and in the daytime slunk about in the distance. As time went by, I noticed a change in their behavior. At first, they were apart from one another, very suspicious and very prone to fight. But after a not very long while, they began to come together and run in packs. And at the time he tells the story, all of the domesticated animals have gone wild again, and the wolves are running in packs over the California mountains. The final thing I want to mention here is the retrospectives and the retellings. A number of plague and epidemic stories focus at the end on history making, that this will go down in history. How will it go down in history? This is a historic moment. Think of how many times in the news in the last weeks you've heard the term unprecedented. And this is a historic high, and so on. As I've mentioned, in Paradise Lost, there is this whole vision of history that comes from Saint Michael, looking out over the history of mankind and seeing plague after plague, epidemic after epidemic, sickness as a consequence of sin. And that relationship between sin and sickness is always an overarching theme. Not simply sickness as a punishment for sin, but sickness as a consequence of sin. For instance, think about the relationship of our corporate sins, I would say, like tearing down the rainforests or overuse of fossil fuels, to the kinds of diseases that are emerging and will continue to, and the effects on the food supply and the effects of a diminishing food supply on human health. So a lot of the retellings involve a scene toward the end of the story where the teller backs up and says, this is what it will look like in history. This is what we know now about our history. And this is, I'm going to conclude by reading you a little piece of this from the end of Jack London's story, The Scarlet Plague. The old grandfather says, all things pass. Only remain cosmic force and matter, ever in flux, ever acting and reacting and realizing the eternal types, the priest, the soldier, and the king. Out of the mouths of babes comes the wisdom of all the ages. Some will fight, some will rule, some will pray, and all the rest will toil and suffer sore, while on their bleeding carcasses is reared, and yet again, without end, the amazing beauty and surpassing wonder of the civilized state. It were just as well that I destroyed those cave stored books. Whether they remain or perish, all their old truths will be rediscovered, their old lies lived and handed down. What is the profit? FIT. And it ends on this ecclesiastical note that we have seen these things before, we will see them again. And we are back at a place of having to begin again because so much has been destroyed. So these sort of the sense of the great cycle of history, and that there are these moments when many of us will be wiped out and the story will start over, is kind of like this pattern in tragedy, in the history of tragedies. The king is dead, long live the king. We will see these things again, but they will never be the same. So that's the note on which a lot of these stories end. And I think because I'm talking to people at Westmont, I really want to say too that the stories of plagues and epidemics are an opportunity to revisit the terms in which we tell the big stories. The plagues and epidemics bring up what is apocalyptic. They bring up eschatological hope. They bring up the question of power and our allegiances to human power, and what kind of power is that forces are at work among us that are not political, that are beyond political. So I think some of the deepest theological questions we live with as people of faith always come up in times of public health crisis, and it's a good time to review them.